Awesome. Okay, so we had a lot of chat about this, which is great,
Yep.
and the multiple flow thing you talked about was great. So I actually want to start specific, and then maybe we can come out broad. I mean, the
Okay.
reason why I want to start specific is I think we agree on a lot of large concepts. So I thought a lot about our existing designs, and I didn't like it. So that's why I came up with a different design, and I wanted to share that with you. And then maybe we can back up and you can tell me why that design is like not good or whatever.
Is that the design linked in the issue at the
Yes,
link at the bottom?
exactly. So 949 here.
All right.
So previously you probably saw a design which is very based on workflows and whatnot. And so this is still somewhat based on workflows, but it's a little bit different. So this concept is pretty much the same. We had a lot of good discussion about what cycle time is. And to me, that's almost orthogonal to this discussion. Like, I don't think we disagree anything there. But in any case, whether we call it cycle time or lead time, we need some way to, for the purpose of a product, to just capture that information. So we need some start and some end, right? And then we can define what those things are. And from a product perspective, it's actually pretty difficult to capture those, I would argue, for the lead time, right? But in any case, we need like a start and an end. So that's what this first feature does. It's really simple. So I don't claim this is a good feature, but I'm just building out my concept, and then we can talk about what to ship first and so forth. But this concept is basically, you have any type of a start time and end time, and you mark it simply with two labels. And then you say that anytime you add this label on an issue, that's when you start counting, and then or start the timer, as it were. And then anytime you add this label complete, then you have an end time. And then so you can calculate total cycle time on the average for any set of issues, and you can scope it. So basically, this is just the very first feature. It's pretty straightforward. So that's that.
Well, it gives you the ability to capture that. That's good because it starts to give you the ability to capture some of the key metrics you're going to need. And so getting this into place will give us the framework and infrastructure for the data we're going to want to generate as we go.
Exactly. And so you'll notice I purposely am not talking about stages here. So that is intentional. So there's no notion of stages here, right? The notion is of events, right? Of what started and what ended. And then the follow-up here is, then this starts to get interesting, which is now instead of in addition to the start and the end, you have additional events in between. So again, the assumption here is from a product perspective, the events are just going to be adding labels, right? Because that's probably the easiest thing to do. But you can see how this extends to something pretty arbitrary, which is great, which I'll get to it in a second. Not arbitrary, but general, arbitrary in a positive sense. But you can see once you have those intermediate events, then you can make an assumption that there is an ordering on this event. So from a configuration perspective, the admin or the team lead or whoever cares, you talk about multiple flows, right? So imagine this is one of many flows, right? And then they say that I impugn this ordering on the events. And if you have this ordering on on this case, it was sort of obvious starting that's the ordering, right? That's sort of obvious. But this one is, if you think about it more specifically from a product perspective, you have to have the user choose that ordering. And the moment they choose that ordering, the stages arise automatically. And so you can think of them as stages, but you don't have to think of them as stages. You can just think of them as the time periods in between these events. And that's what exactly is captured here. The top line is still the end to end, but the ones in between are the intermediate times. And then you can calculate statistics on that. What's interesting, again, from a product perspective, and usually like when we discuss, we don't get too much detail in the product, but in this case, I really want to start there and then we can step back. In this case, you can have all these edge cases, like what if an issue starts and goes into start and goes to complete and then bounces back into review and like does this crazy thing. From a product perspective, I don't care. And I'm just going to say, as a first pass, have some algorithm to say, in the for all events that that was started, and then for all events in review, just aggregate all those
Yeah, it's total
events
time. Yeah, it's
and
total
then
time.
just calculate it, right?
Yeah,
So in
it's total
theory,
time.
yeah. And so in theory, if people are doing this correctly, then these three boxes add up because the sum of the average is the average of the sum, right? From like university math, level math. But in practice, this may be not true because if people are just doing some crazy things, moving things around. So I'm just
Well, but in practice that will happen. Things will go back and forth. I mean, that's
right.
the reality is the world's messy and it will happen. And in
Exactly.
fact, it'll be one of those things that people will want to see because this will be what people will track as an activity called rework.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
the concept of that means, I made a mistake or some sort of a defect or a problem occurred and I've had to
Right.
do it over. And so the idea or the concept, we need to be at least thoughtful about how we build this so we can capture the idea that something went
There's loops
from,
or whatever.
it moved back in the flow, because of the need to do some sort of rework of the
That's a great
activity.
point. That's a great point. And that feeds directly into the concept here in a couple of different screens. But just looking at this screen, the way I've set it up, it doesn't block that concept because if we started the fact with you need to have a stage, you need to define the stage and so on and so forth, then it makes it really hard in the future because then you have to define all those crazy loops and stuff. But if we have the user define events, then the system can help you find those loops, or the loops are, just arise automatically. But the fact is we don't have to force the user to define mutually exclusive stages, which I was getting really hung up on. Like they don't have to assume that, they just have to define events, or tell the system that I care about these events, and then GitLab should tell you some information based on that. So that's a very, very pressing point. And
So
so
when you talk about, let's go back to so you have the idea of, I'm just trying to understand, and maybe I'm too far into implementation, but when we're calling these multiple label events, and in the earlier issue, the first step in MVC is 2 label events.
Yep. Yep.
So what you're imagining, so let me just see if I can say this out loud and see if it makes sense.
Please.
So what you're imagining is I'm going to say this word, overloading labels.
Yeah.
In order to define these sequences and flows.
Right.
And these will be special labels, I assume, that they'll have some sort of special characteristic or criteria that says these are labels that we're capturing key metrics on. Because if you look at the use of GitLab, the way we use GitLab today, we use labels for everything. I mean,
right. Yeah. So I glossed over this. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
These are going to be a superset or a subset of label that's a special label. Is that right?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. And so I'll give you more context, which is this is a debate that Mark Kunsek and I have been hung up for a long time. And one of the reasons is that we were debating about stages, if you recall, right? And then we were saying like with stages, with these things started in reviewing UT, these weren't events in the past in the sense of labels, because labels are used in label lists and they represent workflow stages in issue boards. So we've always thought of labels as representing periods of time because your issue goes into that label stage for a certain time. And then so I've been arguing with Mark Kunsek for a long time, like, no, we need first class workflow stages. And then once we have first class workflow stages, then we can build VSM on top of that. And so let's not, overload these labels. And Mark says, no, I like small primitives. Let's keep using events. So that argument is actually still ongoing technically, but I'm actually trying to sidestep that argument and not even worry about it. So there's two aspects. One of them is the fact that we have key value labels that addresses some of this. And the second fact is I don't actually care about workflow stages anymore. I just care about points in time. And labels are already one way to do points in time. They might actually not be the one in the future, right? We could invent new first class events.
Our question then, are you imagining that all labels will capture the time data related to them? I can't hear you.
So, so that's an implementation detail, and we actually have already done that. So that's actually great for some related but not directly related work with system notes. So we already are capturing the fact that we have. So every time you do this in the system right now, you can see how there's something stored here, right?
Right.
Like maybe like a year ago, what was stored is just this sentence in a system note table, and there's no association with like the label ID and stuff like that. What
Right.
we did is that, and so that's why if you look at some really old issues, it's really funky if you close the issue or migrate the project, whatever, like the label won't be rendered properly and people will complain, like, why is that the case? Don't you just query the label table to produce it? And the answer is no, because we were just storing markdown. And so now what's happening is that, for example, this system note and other system notes that are not labels, like a milestone change, they are still stored as just a system note, like plain text. But this is actually stored like natively, meaning that if there's a database entry saying that this label was associated with this object at this particular timestamp. So we're already capturing that information and storing it as a first class citizen. And therefore, this like we could have, like if we didn't have that, we can build that obviously. But I'm just saying that like half of the work is already been done to support this.
That makes it easier.
Exactly. And to answer your original question, how do we specify that? I'm not saying that we go into the label list and specify, like from a design perspective, you care about VSM. So you go there and you say, I want this label to mean this. So you go in here and you say that I already have a started label, or I'm going to create a label here to mean that it represents started and complete and so on and so forth.
I like this. I like this because this is consistent with the way a lot of times labels are being used.
Exactly. And so, but back to the earlier point that, you know, I had the argument with Mark, and then there's a broader argument that we're overloading labels to mean too many things and it's confusing. That argument still stands. That's still an ongoing debate. That's still a UX problem in GitLab about the fact that we're using labels for too many things. For example, custom fields, right? We don't have that yet. Do we use that with first class citizens, blah, blah, blah. But my point is that we can still proceed with labels because we can define other events in the future that don't use labels. Labels are just, maybe it's the first one, but I'm just using it as the first representative example of illustrating how VSM, likely it will probably be the first feature, but if you or somebody else has a strong reason to not use labels, then this design still stands. And so that's what I was trying to differentiate.
You know, to be honest with you, I tend to agree that we are overloading. If I had to side on the argument of being underloaded or overloading,
right,
I think we're overloading. However, given the fact that we have been using labels the way we've been using labels and what they do for us, and the data that the point that you made about how we've implemented capturing the time data already.
Right here.
It seems so simple to make a couple of steps forward.
That is the argument with small primitives that we're formalizing on the product team that Mark has really been pushing for. So what I want to drive home here is the event part. This is where I was hung up earlier, where I didn't like this view because of the assumption that teams work in this particular flow. And we said that, what if they don't lose this flow? What if there's rework? So my concept here is perhaps there's a way to go beyond just the linearity of this, about this, you know, the lean manufacturing, blah, blah, blah. And then this concept here is that you have some notion of a timeline, right? And then you have events happening. And then the events are that the fact that a person put this issue in review, the person put this issue in UAT, a security stakeholder came in and said, this is violating security. A business owner said, like, we just came up with something, you know, awesome, let's do some rework. So there's all these events that goes on in the life cycle of a feature being developed that can happen at any time from all these personas and roles. And they're just crazy and they don't fit into this model because, you know, a security stakeholder can come in really early on, a compliance stakeholder can come in really late. And we know that, you know, we know the sort of the best practices, the shift left, like everything should happen earlier. And if all the like the security stakeholder comes in at the back at the end, and you do security at the end because you don't have DAST and SAST, and then everything goes to hell at the end, and it forces all that rework, that's a really bad anti-pattern. But how does GitLab tell you that, right? How does GitLab surface that information? And so this visualization and concept is precisely to do that. It's to say there is so many events of the type compliance review, and they all happen at the end of this timeline. And then there's this huge scatter plot of that. And then there's a correlation, which I'm not showing here precisely, but maybe it shows that because due to that high statistical nature of compliance events happening toward the end, your cycle time is really high. And so GitLab should tell you that and suggest like compliance, you should shift left. So that's exactly what this concept is trying to bring out. And that's my amazing idea. That I don't know if it's amazing. So that's
well, I think it'll be an interesting view to see what comes out of it. I'll tell you the thing that I'm looking at the multiple event labels, and I think the view that people are going to want in order to drive improvement, in order to understand their process, one of the ways of slicing that bar chart, which looking at it over month, it is going to be able to highlight which of those label events is consuming the most amount of time, which one of those is the weakest link.
Right.
And if you can, and so rather than listing it as started in review, UAT complete in the kind of the chronological view, you're reading from bottom to top, the way they're stacked right now. If they were stacked another way, in which the longest one was at the bottom,
right?
In that, if I look at this and whichever one is at the bottom, that's my long tent in the pole, or long pole in the tent.
Right.
I'm glad this is recorded. But that's the long tent in the pole that I should work on. Working on all of, if I'm going to have the biggest bang for the buck, it's there. And that was the learnings from the goal, and frankly from the Phoenix project was, in trying to go faster, you can only go as fast as your slowest
the bottleneck
part, right? And so being able to highlight, the question that people will want to know is, this is all nice and pretty, but where should I focus, or where should I look to try to improve my cycle time?
Right.
No, this is the dashboard that says, okay, this tells me what my cycle time is, but it doesn't tell me, it doesn't give me recommendations or clues yet. It's close to it, but I don't think it gives me the clues yet as to what to improve. We're getting really close to that, though, which is really the holy grail here.
Totally agree. I'm clicking around, not because I'm ignoring you, but I'm frantically trying to find an older mock-up that serves exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
I clearly cannot find it.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm going to stop. So, but I hear what you're saying. So what I'm getting out of this conversation is that this is not too spectacular, which is what I expected, because I honestly think this is the future, and I think this is a stepping stone to it. But what I like about what I'm proposing right now is that instead of forcing people to use stages and define stages, and then just slightly, it's like a magic trick, just have them define events instead. It doesn't block us from a future of this, and we can keep going on this one. Go ahead.
The scatter plot one works too, except your horizontal axis is not the timeline; it's the duration.
Yes, that's what it's supposed to be here. Like this is supposed to indicate that this, like on the average, like maybe there's a total here, and so this is not a timeline. This is representing the 14 days here. And it's supposed to represent that there's five issues in this time period, or in this statistical population. And then of those 5 issues, the first one landed here in review, the first one landed here in UAT, and then this one, and then so on and so forth. So the average is somewhere here, the average is somewhere here, and the average is somewhere here. That type of thing.
The challenge with this view is because it implies cumulative nature.
Right.
It's cumulative. it implies that the total project time, if I look at the rightmost issue, the dot at the furthest right at the bottom on complete, that the longest issue took 14 days, the shortest issue took
Oh, right.
12 days. In fact, what this view would be more
No, this
interesting
is just an
if
incorrect view. I think you're right. Like, because this is a cumulative view, which doesn't make sense because
that's right.
it
That's
should
right.
be
If
all
this wasn't cumulative,
Yep.
if this showed, and the word started is confusing because we've used that in the concept of a
Right.
label of a label in defining this concept. So, it's really about how long did an issue spend in any one of
Right.
the label states. That's actually interesting.
Yeah.
And that gets to, so yeah, that's why I went back.
Yeah. No. No. I do. No. Sorry. You mind 30 seconds. This does make sense. So I take back what I said, because these are like cumulative. That's the problem. I think where I think I'm hearing you, which I agree with. So these are labeled events, so that the time in which UAT occurred at this moment in time. So started is 0 time, and then everything is referenced to 0 time was started. And so these are cumulative in the sense that it happened at started plus this amount of time. And so from an event perspective, this view makes sense because you can see that the completed actions took later are congregated toward later in the life cycle. I still totally agree with you that this is not very intuitive, or maybe a more advanced user would use this. And this is the more direct thing, because most humans have a sense that these are still mutually exclusive stages, right? And you want to optimize for that. And it's the lean manufacturing thing and so on and so forth. But again, my point being is that I don't like how its boxes is in, because it's going back to the point where well, I mean, this is where let's talk more broadly then. I think this is a good point to do that, which is we've always been talking about, and so yeah, this is the fundamental question I have. So let's switch there. We've always been talking about, like, we've seen customers go from like not using stages at all, or in the past it's waterfall, then they use like stages, right, in review and blah, blah, blah. And then some people are just doing hardcore Kanban where there's no stages at all. And then they're just, shipping software. And so my question to you is that, why is this view still relevant in like 5-10 years, when most people don't really care about individual stages and optimizing them? They just care about ripping the most important thing off the list, and then having people hyper collaborate, and they're measuring all the time together, but they don't care about the individual stages because they don't exist. So let me start there, and then maybe understand what I'm missing.
If I guess the question is to how likely is it that large enterprise customers are going to adopt are going to get to that level of maturity where they don't have a set of defined steps, or that they don't define a flow. I was in a webinar Monday with CTO at the Air Force and a chief of security at Capital One. And the common theme, and these are people that are driving DevOps transformations and digital transformations in their organizations. And Capital One, they're
right.
pretty darn advanced.
Yep.
And there was a consistent theme in that panel discussion about having a defined kind of set of ways of tools and processes that they expect people to work in, because they expect that consistency. And if you're running an organization with 10,000 developers, there's a degree of accountability that you have to be able to demonstrate from compliance and flow and making sure the right evaluations and tests and everything else are being applied to the changes that are going live. And I think that that there's a conflict between this idea that we're going to just rip stuff off of the backlog and we'll work on the most important and ship as fast as we possibly can, which is what we try to do here. But I don't know if in a large financial services or a regulated industry or an organization that they have to impose some structure on it, if that'll always apply. So
So you don't think like it's realistic? Like there's always going to be structure. Another way to put it, like even if this promise of DevOps transformation, we keep going 10 years down the road, there's always going to be structure because there's always going to be regulatory things. There's always going to be
Yeah.
risk mitigation. There's always going to be a chief risk officer at a company that says like, you always need to check blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And then so this will always be needed, I guess is the point. And then it's a matter of how you maybe overlay this on top of this, make this a little bit smarter or evolve this so you can see the rework like we talked about earlier.
I think that so I think the premise that the defined set of flows or activities in a development lifecycle and the way people work
Right.
is somehow going to go away.
Right.
I think that premise, while it may be true in some organizations, there will be some examples of that where that happens, where people are building fairly, customer-centric, customer-facing web properties that aren't financially sensitive, that aren't in a regulated industry. I think there will be examples of that where people will do that and will operate a model that's very dynamic and very fluid. Totally get it. And I think we are at some level an example of that. We're leaning in that direction.
Right.
I think there will always be, though, for a long time.
Yeah.
Always is probably the wrong word, but for a long time, larger
for the purpose of GitLab, yeah. for the purpose
for the purposes of the next 5 years, next 10 years, that need's going to exist, and I believe that the people that are going to want to buy a piece of technology to help them be more effective are going to look for something that allows them and enables them to find what their expected work activity is, and then to measure and to get feedback as to, well, how's it going, right? And if they wanted, and I think they will always have the option of, well, I don't want to do that. I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to do it a different way. That'll always exist. But if we don't have it as a capability, and we just say, well, y'all need to get to be fluid and flexible, and then this will all work for you.
Right.
I don't think that's a good business model for us.
Right. I agree with that. Okay, no. So that's really helpful. I think that's what I expected. I'm really happy that we're not boxing ourselves. Or there's another reason why I don't like the workflow stages, because when I started designing workflow stages and thinking about whether we use workflow stages or labels to represent those workflow stages, we have to think about the next. What do we do next? So it's got to be automation. It's got to tie in with merge requests. And then I started going crazy, because then you have to, what are those events, or what are those stages? And that's do we add merge requests to issue boards? How about pipelines? And so that gets really, really messy when you start with stages and saying the stages must be an issue board. I used to think that let's start with an issue board. That's an awesome idea. I still think it is, and I'll show you a mock-up in a second. But that was actually tying me down and boxing me in from leveraging other parts of GitLab, which we must do. And so the concept, so what I'm hearing is that we should build this on the left, obviously. The dots are great. Probably we don't need to build that. That's a nice to have. It's something.
No, well, the dots are easy. I think the hard part on the left is your 3 arrows at the top.
Right. Well, what do you mean? In what sense?
Well, so frankly, the data that shows up in the stacked bar chart,
right?
You have that. I mean, frankly, you could probably create the stacked bar chart today. You have the data.
Right. Yeah, we essentially could.
I think where the harder part is defining what that defined sequence of
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
The linear is, if someone wants to define a linear flow that it goes from started to in review to UAT to complete, say those are the 4 steps with the 3 transitions, then I think that the question then is how do we both define that with labels, that labels must go in this sequence, A, B, C, D, E. Is it one way? Does it, if they go in the opposite order or flow, backstream, do we, how do we I mean, I think the challenge that we're facing, and I don't think it's insurmountable. I think, but I think the hard part is and I'm drawing on my screen. You're not seeing it, but is in those three
Right.
arrows.
So are you saying it's a challenge because conceptually it's hard to map to user expectation? Is that because
I
like
think
from
that,
like a technical design perspective, I think it's straightforward, but I would agree that it's we
I
design it,
think
but maybe nobody uses it and it sucks.
I think it's anticipating how we implement that and how we anticipate how is that going to work and how are we going to is that going to be something that who will have what permission level will someone have to have in
Right.
order
I
to
see what you're saying.
that
Yeah.
sequence? How are we going to, I think there's details in that we have to think through. That let's assume that you're a big financial services customer,
Right.
G, starts with the G, right? Let's just assume that in your large organization, you want steps A through E in that
Correct.
order is the flow you're defining, and your 10,000 developers need to,
Right.
all your work has to go through those 5-lettered steps.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm the CIO. I decided that.
Yep.
It means that, Jimmy, the developer, doesn't get to willy-nilly reorder that or change it.
Right.
And so it's a question of how are we going to implement that rule, those business rules that someone wants to impose on their
Right. I see what you're
organization.
saying. Yeah.
Because traditionally, our philosophy has been not to put the tool in the place of imposing business rules.
Well, do you mean like constraints, or we definitely have business rules, but or maybe when you say business rules, you mean like I think we have this like not conventional
Well,
configuration,
an
custom
example would be to
enforced
have
workflows. Enforced
yeah,
workflows. I think that was the bad word that we've been saying that we wanted to avoid. Is that what?
yeah, but I think that culturally we've tended to be more, from a philosophical approach to the way we build the product, to be much more flexible and to push and empower developers.
I don't
No?
think, I think that's more of a mistake of us not being good enough in our product. I don't think that was intentional philosophy. I think it's just like, oh, it's really powerful. You can do all these things with projects and groups, and now like customers are complaining that it's so difficult to.
It's too powerful.
It's So I don't think that was intentional. I think it's just because we've been, the philosophy I don't think is about necessarily about openness. It's about, we want to cover more scope and cover more use cases. So we've been chasing a lot of functionality and breadth, and then we've been really hammered down on the depth. And so I would classify the business rules and maybe a little bit more helping people go a certain direction in terms of that.
And maybe that's the way we position this, as we're establishing a set of business rules that the flow of work in this group or in this project goes
Right.
A, B, C, D, E.
Yes.
But you got to understand also that people will add F to it. They will add B2 to it because they're trying to improve something. They'll insert things. So it's going to be dynamic and it will change, but it's going to change at a slower pace, I think, than, it'll change less frequently.
And so that's one of the reasons I love the event approach, because
it's flexible.
It's flexible. It's extensible. You can build those controls, constraints, enforcement, whatever you want to call, on top of that. But we don't have to worry about, like when I was thinking about stages, and I'm like, oh, then we have to figure out what these stages are. You can have you have sub stages, you have stages at the group level, and then at the project level, you can overload those stages and add more or subtract. And it was getting really messy. And so with events, you just have a base set of events. You can collect and track those events. You can have external controls about how certain issues can flow into certain events, but it's a totally separate problem to be solved. And everything that you said, we can iterate on top of, but it doesn't fundamentally constrain it. So that's why I like the event approach.
How do you do? So you said something I'd like to riff on.
Please.
I think it's perfectly flexible. I think this design is perfectly appropriate for it. So I think you've got it covered. Substages.
Right. So sub stages, how I would think about that is that let's use our example, right? Mr. or Mrs. CIO says there's these 5 stages because he or she wants visibility for all projects and issues. And then an individual team, they want, because there's more regulation, their review stage is broken out into 3 additional sub stages with, like code review, regulatory review, security review. And then so they would just have those 3 sub events. But the moment that they enter that review stage, at the high level, it stays there. And then at the sub level or in that project level, it goes into additional stages, but it did not exit the in review stage, or it did not go into the next stage at the high level. So then it still works because all you're tracking is events. There's no notion of being inside a stage actually. Like your code abstraction logic, your business logic, using your terms, business rules, will take the events and then manage it as it needed on the feature set that it needs to be. So it doesn't, at the base level, it doesn't matter. So that's a great example of how this could be leveraged.
Well, and it allows for, shifting left and parallelism as well.
Exactly. That was the original concept.
Right.
About what I said. Like, we have an organization where you're doing your regulatory review in the stage that you've defined it as a label, but in the future, this is exactly what this issue is. Let's have an event, a customizable event where you associate a persona and maybe like some metadata, right? Or maybe just the persona, right? Or maybe, hopefully, maybe we have roles in the future. And then one of those roles is going to be compliance stakeholder, right? Or compliance officer, or compliance analysis. And then you have that compliance analyst just type comments in the issue, and then you log that. And then that is an event itself that you've customized and you've told to the system that you care about. And then, and so that's what's that here. Well, what is that there? And then that would appear in the scatter plot. So even though the compliance analyst logs a comment, that event is not a stage in itself. It never doesn't have to be a stage, but having that information, ensuring that the compliance analyst was always doing it at the end, that's super valuable information. Maybe it's more of like a really, edge feature, but it's something that we could build, and I think would be pretty good.
This parent-child idea of a hierarchy of labels that could correspond to this flow,
right,
is interesting. And it's interesting because I think it would open the door for us to really talk about working concurrently and move away from linear.
Right, exactly. That's why when I was slacking you and William, I was frustrated because like this word concurrent DevOps has been in the back of my brain forever. And then we've always talked about these linear workflows. And then in seeing how GitLab operates, we clearly don't operate like this. And there's this huge dissonance in my brain. And so this is precisely how this came up. And I wanted to solve it. I went like, this doesn't make sense. And I went in one huge direction. And I said, let's throw away linearity and let's just do concurrency. And then like William said, no, Victor, like concurrency doesn't mean throw away. Well, he didn't say that. He just reminded me concurrency was hammering on the point that in GitLab, everybody can type on an issue at any time they want. So that opened the door to me a little bit. And then you reminded me like, no, Victor, we still need flows. And then so I'm trying to marry the two concepts here. And so.
No, I'm completely with you. But the potential, when you said sub work, so if I think of this at the kind of the group level, program organization level, that's going to define a set of, here are the
oh, let's write it out. Yeah.
The steps you need to do.
Right.
That's one layer of it. But when I think about the compliance activity, the compliance work, right?
Right.
If there were 5 different, so imagine for a moment that one of us is the leader responsible for compliance activity in the organization.
Right.
And we in our team are going to define 5 different activities that go into doing compliance. Now, we're not saying we're going to do compliance at the end. Right. In fact, we might do compliance work really early. And what does that mean?
Exactly. Yep. I hear you. Like, Well, to me, what that means is that it's flexible because you can do compliance. You can overlay that on the flow. You can have multiple flows, like you mentioned earlier. You can have compliance as a sub flow here. It can even be a separate, from a business perspective, it can be, you can
It's a
manage
whole
a
separate.
separate,
Yeah, it's a whole
separate business process, which is also a good thing, right? Because you can have your
yeah, yeah,
development team follow one flow, and then you can have your compliance team say, they must do it on a different cadence. It could be not even snapped to the issue cadence, but it could be like, every Monday they have to look at all issues and do something. I don't know if that even makes sense, but it does.
no, it does. It completely does. And what I'm getting to in my mind is saying, look, if I have compliance steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, just not to confuse ourselves with the
Right.
A, B, E sequence. And let's say E was the compliance step or the compliance event, right?
Right.
E is really not an event. The events are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So
I see what you're saying.
E1, E2, E3, E4, and E5 are the events that happen. And the cumulative activity of those events, the cumulative metrics of those events would add up to what the total for E was. You may never really do E. Really you're going to do E1, E2, E3, E4, E5. And really what you've done then is what you could be doing is establishing a parent-child relationship between labels,
Right. Right.
that the child labels are the actual events or the actual activities that someone would do.
Mm-hmm.
And
Is
the
that is,
topper,
if you see
go
my
ahead.
screen, is that, no, I just wanted to make sure I'm capturing your concept here in the screen so that we're on the same page. Is that like sort of what you're thinking about here?
Hang on, let me make it big screen.
No, yeah, I
Um,
apologize for my.
no, it's fine. Yeah, I do this. I do exactly the same thing. I do exactly the same thing in a note document. So,
So you're saying
correct.
this breaks down into these 4 events, as you're saying, are you calling them?
Yes. So yeah. So if compliance was actually those things, right?
Right.
Imagine a scenario where, and actually in this scenario, your E1, start and stop of E1, adds into start and stop of compliance. Start and stop of E2
Mm-hmm,
adds
mm-hmm.
to start. And it may not be, it may not be that E1 leads to E2, leads to E3, leads to E4. Those are just the events that happen.
I see what you're saying. Right,
I'd
right.
take out the arrows.
Right, I see what you're saying, because like a E3, these might be just the required things that need to be done by
That's
4
right.
separate people, and they can be done in
That's right.
parallel or whatever.
That's right. And E1 might happen during the business proposal before development even starts.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Right.
So then it's more of its approvals flow is what you're saying. A gate.
No, I don't know if I want to call it an approval flow. It could be. I mean, you could read it as approval flow, but and I think of QA.
Well, I mean, it's a blocking gating flow, right? Like
it could be.
You're saying that these events must occur before anything, or maybe it just must be done before the whole thing is shipped to production. So
again, this is the business rule challenge of how do people want to implement this, and,
right.
and what I'm getting to is the idea of defining the second layer of sub labels or of sub stages.
Right.
Gets into where the actual events are, because the event isn't development, the event isn't compliance, right?
Right.
The events are the details that are deeper into this.
Exactly.
And I'm just and actually, for sake of argument, just let's change those. You can change those E's to C1, C2, so that way at least it maps to what you have above it. And similarly, you could have D1, D2, D3, D4,
exactly.
and you could have the similar subsets. But then the deal would be is that what you'd really be then tracking and managing would be, and visualizing would be, a roll up at the development compliance UAT production level, or a more granular view that illustrates of these specific activities or events or activities of what's happening with them.
Yep. So yeah,
and
yeah,
there,
I hear it.
and this is where an organization, a business may say, I expect this to happen in from left to right in a order. They might want to impose that rule in their organization. They
Right,
might say C4 must be complete before we go to UAT,
right,
before
right.
proceeding. This is where being able to define the business rules around these events we're going to need feedback from the
Yeah,
community. But I think the business rules will exist at this layer more so
yeah,
than the top.
I see what you're saying. So to me, the underlying mechanism should both be events, but I think what you're arguing is that from a user perspective, there's a great feature here to have like
Yeah.
at least two concepts. One is a flow concept, one is an event concept, and so that maybe perhaps like like an event concept for the business rules, like you said, and then this is more of like a product development driven concept, and then this is maybe like a what's a really broad word? I don't know if compliance is the right word, but like safety or like risk mitigation
Well, I mean,
mitigation thing, right?
the reason that the word life cycle is applied to software development or any of these is it's implying a set of rules or
Mm-hmm.
processes that we expect people to follow. So that way, as a developer, as a tester, as a project manager or product manager, you know what you need to do
Right.
to comply to win the organization to go from idea to production. Otherwise, it's random.
Right. Back to your original point. Like there needs to be some structure, and it's how we provide that structure in the midst of this chaos, right? Yep.
Yeah, because I think this layer, the second layer, is
Right.
where there will be very keen interest on what are the rule, and I think it's the same as the top. I think if we think about the first layer of this
Right.
with the same construct of is there a rule about linearity that
Right.
B must go to C, must go to UAT? Is there a rule about tracking things
Right.
moving you know in the opposite direction?
Right.
Is there a rule about um, about things being skipped,
Right.
right? Um, and I think if we get that right, then if you say, okay, well, my compliance sub steps are
Right.
C1 through C4, the same kind of rules could apply. And in fact, once you get to that lower level, that's when you'll have some issues, though. Because if you establish a set of rules at the parent level, when you get to the child level, can you break those rules? Could you start compliance before development?
Well, yeah, like I think we can avoid like this is getting really into details in the weeds here, but like whether it's one or two levels or whatever, like when we design, if we do decide from a user perspective that there's two levels, even the design, I wouldn't like have it be first class. Like the background shouldn't know about two levels. There should be n levels. And my point being is that you can think of these as stages, but they're still events because development stage is really just the development start event and the development end event. The same with compliance. So the way I think
Well,
about
but here's the question though is how we support. It's that second. It's the arrow between development ends and compliance starts.
mm-hmm.
It's is there a rule, a business rule on that transition?
Yes,
And
yeah,
how do we give the user the ability to enforce the rules on that arrow, that second arrow?
mm-hmm. I agree. I agree. And so
Right.
so in the original model, this is one event, right? If this is one event, then it's sort of by default that is the business rule. It's understood to be the business rule because you can enforce that, right? In this case, it's I don't know. Maybe I take that back. So this is we're getting very
I think if
esoteric.
we're today, today in GitLab, that's the way it works because you're moving a list, you're moving an issue from from a label list.
Right. Yeah, but we're
Right?
like, yeah. Maybe we're not on the same page anymore because that is true today, but there's no enforcement of that. So
That's
that,
right.
right.
Well, I mean, it's by default, and you have no other. Well, you do have options. I mean, you can go around the board. The way the board works.
Exactly. Exactly. So there's a lot there, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like the baseline structure is there, but the enforcement mechanism is not clear at all.
Well,
you don't have one, and how should we build it?
and it gets into the how do you define what that expected sequence is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other question is the other way to look at the business rules, you have to do compliance in every project. It doesn't have to happen after development's done. It should happen while development's happening. So there's this idea of it must be done or it's optional.
Right. Exactly.
Oh, now I've got a headache. I'm glad we recorded my headache today. But I'm glad to join your headache though, because I can see.
Yeah, there's a lot here, but I think there's more than enough to start. So that's what I'm excited about. And what I wanted to bring full circle is like we talked about a lot of those crazy events, but what I'm excited about is that because if it is indeed an event-driven system, it doesn't have to be labels, right? We started talking about labels, but now we're deep into events, and events are just any thing that happen, and they could be associated with any object, and we can invent objects, and we can associate events with people, which is a concept in GitLab, which is great. And then I think this would be exciting as something we build very early here with just associate a board with that concept. And so the association is simply if you have an issue board with these labels already as lists, then with one click, you can configure this screen because you have the issue board already created and associated with it. And so that you have this type of UI on top of an issue board off the bat. So that's sort of like the obvious thing we can build, within a couple of months. But what we talked about for the past, 30 minutes will keep us busy for like at least a year. But if we just execute on this concept with labels, integrating with the board, I think we'll be in very good shape already. And then
I think it takes us it takes us clearly a few steps down the path, and I think where we're headed is likely to get to the place where we have to consider this hierarchy idea. But
right, exactly. I like the conversation I got out of today is connecting those events into a hierarchy and making those connections. I think that's
well, and it's understanding the optionality that some businesses, some organizations are going to insist on the ability to impose structure.
Right.
Others will not, and we have to be able to serve both.
Well, if we serve the former, we should be able to serve the latter, right?
Correct. Yeah, the tougher one is serving the one that wants to impose structure.
Yeah. Well, and I guess doing it in a way that doesn't make it alienating to the latter and having sensible defaults and all that. So that is not easy either.
No.
Okay. Yeah. No. Thank you for this time, John.
This is awesome.
Get this on YouTube.
Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. No. Thank you.
And thank you for the feedback on the MQ work. I'm excited about. We can't talk about, but your feedback and your contributions are excited.
Yeah.
Exciting, and it's. I'm looking forward to when that gets published. So
definitely.
Well, one last thing, since we are recording this and you're going to put it on YouTube, on Gartner's Peer Insights. If anyone's followed along this long. Your contributions, inputs into Gartner Peer Insights is absolutely fantastic. We've had over 30 different reviews of GitLab. It says 32 different reviews on our agile planning tools on GitLab. So
okay, I did. So
absolutely 30.
That Peer Insights is the thing that Gartner puts together as a.
Here, let me share.
Sure, please.
Here, let me share my screen. I'll share my screen and I'll show you. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's one of the coolest things that I've seen happen with what we do at GitLab. You see my screen?
I do.
So if you go to Gartner Peer Insights, gartner.com/.
I've seen this page. Like Joyce has probably sent this page to me.
Yeah. but so here's type in GitLab. Now we've been up there for application release orchestration for a while, so it's
Right.
been up for probably
128.
longer.
Yep.
There's 128 people have looked at GitLab for release orchestration, and with an overall combined rating of what is it, 4 point something? Can't tell from here. But we were customers' choice for release orchestration.
Right.
If I go back and I search for enterprise agile planning tools, which is where we are,
right,
GitLab, there are 32 reviews. They just started this, and
it's a lot.
3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah.
Or it says 31 verified reviews.
Okay.
20 of them are 5-star reviews.
Wow,
I mean, our overall rating, if we go to the total space of this, here's a little GitLab with a 4.6 rating.
Wow, that's
let's sort this list by rating.
Just to make it clear.
Just to make it clear.
Wow.
And, okay, so there's a couple of them that have similar.
We'll just say they're biased because they only have 9 or less reviews, so it's a statistical anomaly.
Yeah.
We'll put ourselves at the top.
Of those products with more than 30 reviews,
we are number one.
We are number one.
That is impressive.
Then there's Target Process with a 4.4.
Wow, this is great. So this is not Gartner. This is just
this is people,
Joe Schmo off the street, right? Wow.
No, they're not. It's not Joe Schmo off the street. These are the users and the people that are using GitLab. These are people who.
These are the real experts, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, this is really cool. I mean, for me, so even if we could say people with more than 10 reviews, I mean,
right.
So yeah.
No, this is great. I did not know that. Okay, so even before waiting from the experts at Gartner themselves, these are like you said, the community, the actual users are rating us high. I love it.
Which is fantastic. Which is something that's just amazingly awesome, and I'm so excited to be part of this, and it's fun to watch.
Definitely.
I watch this probably at least a couple of times a week. I take a look because there's new reviews coming in every other day. It seems
that's surprising. I did not know it was so active. I got to take a look.
So there, I've added that to our recording. I think it's
Thank you, John. That's the best part of today so far. I do appreciate it.
Thanks, Victor. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.